That's looking okay. All right. Thank you. Okay, so we're doing this event, this online event now, or partially online event, as part of the EPSRC Net Zero week that is running this week in Glasgow. So just to say that. And we have set up a provocation here. And one of the things we often do in the SuperGen Energy Networks Hub is talk a lot about the importance of energy networks, because most of us believe passionately about the importance of energy networks. So I thought, rather than doing an event that's like that again, and maybe try and flip it round the other way and set up a challenge that says that maybe energy networks won't be needed in the future. So we've got this idea that if energy storage becomes ubiquitous, and I guess what's embedded in that is that it's available, there are enough materials available in the world, it's affordable, accessible, and therefore it can be rolled out across all vectors, by the way, as well. Then perhaps if you couple that with decentralized generation, perhaps we might not need networks anymore, or we might need them less. That's the kind of premise that I'm setting up. And I suppose where I'm coming from there is that the original reason for energy networks, or some of the important original reasons for building energy networks, were to exploit the temporal and spatial diversity of generation and load. So the fact that generation and load is distributed around a country, and also the demands are distributed throughout time, means that energy networks often bring, and have done for decades, bring advantages. The other thing that people built energy networks for originally was to realize the value of economies of scale. So you could build large power stations, but connect them up to a big set of customers with that diversity. So I suppose what I'm saying now is, if storage becomes a very affordable, effective solution, and generation is now small and decentralized, are some of those drivers for energy networks now no longer present? So that's the challenge. So I'll go to the panel now for some thoughts. So I'll start with you, David, and please introduce yourself first.
Okay, hi, so I'm David Greenwood. I'm an academic track fellow in Whole Systems Approaches to Energy at Newcastle University. The way I've decided to think about this was, what is it that kind of storage versus networks, what do they both actually do? And it's like Phil said, they both kind of allow us to match the supply to demand in some way. And they can both help us to have a network which is, or well, have a way of supplying energy to people, I suppose, a system which is resilient. They're also both, at the moment, relatively expensive to build. I mean, I guess part of this premise is that storage would become cheaper, but whether it would be cheap enough that we completely didn't need networks anymore, I don't know. And that's because I think the other thing they have in common is they both have kind of diminishing returns. So neither networks nor storage actually generate any energy. All they let you do is move it about through space or through time. And so you could have an infinite energy network or an infinite amount of energy storage and still not be able to meet all the demand in your system if you're not generating enough energy in the place all the time that you need it. So I think you need a kind of an optimal combination of both, which you know, you're building enough network and enough storage that you're not getting to that point of diminishing returns for either of them. And if you think about, you know, that should be, in a simple trivial example, pretty easy to calculate. In any real system, it would be much harder to calculate, and there are some extra complications of both which I think make it more difficult. And the other thing is very dependent on the context of your system. So if you end up with a system where there is lots of very distributed generation, then probably the value you get initially from storage is higher and the diminishing returns come in more slowly for storage. But if you have a system where you've got lots of centralized generation and that kind of large power plants, things like offshore wind, then probably the pendulum swings the other way and you get better initial returns on energy networks and slower returns on energy storage. I think that's a good example with that offshore wind, because no one lives in the sea. So if you're going to build offshore wind, you've got to have some energy network somewhere. There are also some pretty key differences. So storage, in the most part, and this isn't true for all storage, but certainly some storage, is much quicker to deploy than energy networks. Storage only moves energy through time, unless you've got some kind of weird system where you ship batteries around on trucks or something. But I think that's the corner case. But it's also got a relatively short lifetime, but that's not necessarily a disadvantage, because it means that you're not locked into a decision you make for a long time. And the other thing about storage is there's very limited legacy infrastructure. So these are different questions if you start from nothing versus if you start from the situation we have now, where actually we've got loads of network and not very much storage. Networks, on the other hand, are slow to deploy. They only move energy through space, not through time. And they've got a really long lifetime. And that could be an advantage, but also that can be a disadvantage, because if you build a network for 60 years, and then in 10 years, it turns out everyone's built storage and you don't need the network anymore, you're locked into that cost and you're still going to have to pay for it somehow. But on the flip side of that, there's already a lot of network that we can take advantage of. And I just want to close by saying, you know, when I did my degree, the first thing I was told in my network on energy lectures was there's no storage in the energy network. And that was a lie. There was some storage, not very much. And the network actually couldn't operate without storage, because you have to have something to make up for any instantaneous imbalance in supply and demand. And so I would say any future system is going to have some network. Depending on what it looks like, it might just be some LV feeders. It might be, you know, huge multinational transmission systems that ship huge amounts of offshore wind around. And it depends on what the decisions you make everywhere else are.
Okay. Thank you, David. That's great. Furong.
Hi, good morning. I'm Professor Furong Lee from Bath University, and I'm the co-director for Energy Hub for Energy Network. So I would give a bit of challenge that if offshore and nuclear power are going to be a key factor in our energy mix, then we are going to need energy network. And in fact, we need both network and storage working together well, and for a very considerable time, so they can shift energy from between location over time, so that can align energy customers' demand with low carbon supplies and network. I think that in order for us to see that how energy storage and energy network can help us align demand with the low carbon resources, we really need to look at three key questions. How energy storage actually located in our network, and how they can best work with each other. And currently, in reality, we don't even have a clear picture how electric vehicles and heat pump might connecting to substations at our distribution network. And understanding this is actually quite difficult question, because EVs registration information at Department of Transport have no bearing with electrical information, and none with the sensors information. So I think that our work currently the work we are doing is try to utilizing a range of information from sensors, from Department of Transport, from utilities, network spatial information, plus trial information to inform our network, various energy storage actually connected to network, and how the energy usage patterns might look like. And another thing, we actually see clear patterns of a clustering. We knew there are clustering effects, but we didn't realize it's so clearly related with the social demographic information. And we clearly see in Bath City, once you zoom into most affluent area, we also got the largest EV uptakes. And if you zoom into most deprived area, we almost related with them very poor uptakes. So when you come into identify network pressure, then this cluster effect got to take into effect. And when you come into pricing, then we need to think that when we pricing energy storage for operating at the right location, right time, we possibly need to consider the time of charge and discharge, location of charge and discharge, and duration, and also the ability to shift energy over time. But on the other side, we also need to consider social elements. And social elements possibly need to consider the purpose of this energy needs, is that for power, is that for heating, for transport, or for swimming pool. So how you square that balance between economic efficiency with the social efficiency. I think I would stop here.
Thank you, Furong. Alessandra.
Yes, so I'm Alessandra Parisio. I'm a senior lecturer in the Power and Energy Division at the University of Manchester. And given my control background, I'm always particularly interested in the control challenges in the energy revolution that we are witnessing today. There are many, many control challenges. And I have been working with energy, trying to develop control systems that can coordinate a very large number of storage devices embedded in mainly into distribution networks to help the grid to operate in a more efficient and flexible way. So I always thought that we need actually energy networks, electricity networks, but not only. So this very interesting question. So what happens if the storage systems becomes very widespread and also cheap? So you can start thinking of several scenarios. So if, for example, we have widespread PV panels, widespread combos made for each household with PV panels and batteries, you might think that, okay, you can charge during the midday when you have PV generation, and you can, of course, use the battery, the energy stored in the battery during the night, and that would reduce the pressure on the actual electricity grid. And you can do the same. So with cheap storage could be also used to regulate the wind output in a similar way. However, you would need also the network for that. So what might happen is that the total demand curve will become more flattened and smoother, also at a more granular time level. And actually renewables with sufficient battery capacity, you can think they might become also baseload plants in the future. However, if households with PV panels and batteries with proper sizes can be self-sufficient, one can think that they could go off grid, and so they might not need the grid anymore. And actually, this has been a debate about the so-called network death spiral. So what happens if more and more households or people go off grid? This might lead to much higher network charges to the remaining grid-connected households, pushing, if storage and PV panels are more and more cheap, this could lead or push people to go off, more and more households to go off grid. And this might lead us to think that the energy network might not be needed. But researchers have analyzed that and try to assess what would happen for different sizes of PVs and different sizes of batteries. And to shorten the long story, they basically couldn't find any optimal sizing of PV and battery such that people or households could be basically self-sufficient. So there are too many planning, cost, and reliability issues. And so the conclusion might be is for me that we need the network, because with the network and with the storage systems very widespread, we can basically try to develop tools to manage this to coordinate these devices, which brings flexibility and can benefit all the people. So this is my conclusion, is that we need the network.
Thanks, Alessandra. So before I open it up to the audiences, just a couple of responses from me, maybe, so we can have a little bounce back around. So picking up on your comments, David, and you kind of hinted at it, if we think about a gas network, and we think about the line pack in a gas network, then are storage and networks the same thing in that case, or is that still different? Is that is that a network with inherent storage in it, and therefore maybe my premise is misses the point a little bit there, particularly if that's a hydrogen network with line pack in the future, for example? What do you think about that?
It is a network with inherent storage in, but you can also build separate storage on top of it. But I suppose the more you move towards this decentralized model and start, potentially moving to a gas network that's more dependent on kind of locally produced gas or hydrogen and doesn't have necessarily the kind of transmission capabilities, you might start to lose some of that storage that you've got. And then
so it seemed to me there were two ways in which potentially the way you describe the differences or similarities between storage and networks break down. There's a little bit is the line pack, because that's got spatial movement and temporal movement, and it's kind of a network and storage. And then the other one obviously is the electric vehicles, which are mobile in space and in time. So I guess that was just wanting to bring that out. And then I'll just say a few responses, and then you can all chip in if you like. I think that we, maybe Alessandra and Furong to an extent, talked a lot about residential or domestic customers. I guess the big question, or our big question, is about industry, heavy intensive energy users like industrial sites. Is it feasible to think about storage and on-site generation in a similar way, or not? Or would be one question. Anyone want to take that?
So I think that battery storage systems and can definitely help also the industrial, because there are, for example, if you think of the foundation industries, that they are very, very energy intensive, they might face many issues, also financial issues, when the decarbonization becomes more and more a real thing, and they need to do something, and storage devices might need to decouple and help with maintaining the business as usual in terms of production, but actually try to reduce the impact, the pressure on the grid, and also try to be more efficient and minimize the energy use. So
Thank you.
Yeah,
Furong?
I think that's for heavy industry, the energy prices really impact on their profitability. And so currently high energy prices really put a huge pressure on the industry's operation. So I would imagine that dependent how efficient, how affordable, how dependent on the grid supply into the future. For now, it's already causing people to think very differently. Certainly for industry, and it is cheaper to set up on-site generation plus energy storage with the renewable energy. It's both cheap and self-dependent. That cost in the past it's really expensive. It becomes much less so. And I also be talking to community energy extensively in recent weeks and months, and they also began to say that communities in the past, they thinking much less about electric vehicles and heat pump. And now they really seriously think this is an option, I think both due to affordability and security.
Okay, thanks, Furong. So I'm wondering whether I might be able to bring Modita in here, who's in the room physically here with us in Newcastle, to bring in the point that you mentioned to me earlier about the international scene, because I think a lot of what we've talked about here as well assumes there is an existing network infrastructure and we're sort of bringing storage into it. So I wonder, Modita, could I hand to you and just talk us through that a little bit? You might have to speak up quite loud for the microphone, I'm not sure, but.
Sure. I don't know if everybody can hear me from the full. Okay, great. No, just I was thinking about the example. I had to advise my brother who lives in Sri Lanka. We have a good network developed in Sri Lanka for electricity supply. But currently it's kind of because of the economic crisis. So there's lots of power cuts lasting 2 to 5 hours every day. So So there's a huge movement of installing off-grid solar plus battery solutions at individual homes and also businesses to counter. The cost doesn't matter, the cost has been so spiked up, but those who can afford those off the PV panels and battery storage to go in are just installing, they don't care. They like the idea of solar PV and being sustainable. If they can afford it, they're not looking at the economics. They're more interested in the reliability of power and having access to it. So that's why I wondered. There's a lot of, the technical solution might be the most cost-effective option. May not be what might drive when you consider the international context for this kind of technology. It might be more people's preferences, what's going on in an economic, political context. So I think to answer that question, whether storage, with storage, does the network doesn't have the same role, might vary based on where in the global context we are and what's going on. So the technical answer may not always be the right answer, and certainly not from the people's point of view.
Thanks, Mudita. Great points. So clearly there's a link there between the economic situation, but also the reliability of the network. And the poorer the reliability of that, the more it might actually push us in to one side of this debate we've got here or not. The other piece that I think you made before as well is, how about countries that are building infrastructure or building energy systems from scratch?
Yes.
So they don't have any networks at all. If you're starting with a blank sheet of paper, where's the balance then between the use of storage and decentralized generators and networks? Okay. So just checking online, Robert, you made a comment about just reminding us that energy storage is not just batteries, and you've listed a number of storage technologies there, which I think is absolutely right. And the hydrogen point. Robert, would you like to come in and make that yourself?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it was just the discussion seemed to be concentrating very much around batteries. But many energy storage solutions are going to be special facilities, and so they're still going to require a network to make use of it. And then there was also the question of whether one could use storage to move in space, not just time. And the case of hydrogen, I wanted to mention, we used to have hydrogen, well, it's mixed with carbon monoxide in our gas. That was what our gas system was before we switched to methane. So it's perfectly feasible to have hydrogen distribution around the country.
Thanks, Robert. It feels like we're blurring the boundary between what is storage and what's a network here. David.
I just want to say, I think you said that we focused a lot of focus on batteries. I think that's true. But I think that's partly because the premise of the question, if you take away the network, then domestically, that means households have to have their own storage. And I think it's not that plausible that they would necessarily have hydrogen or compressed air or pumped hydro storage in their house, unless you live in like Cragside. So for domestic, I think that the batteries are kind of, at the moment at least, the only real game in town. But I also, building on from that, I think that the way the supply industry is structured, it strongly incentivizes people that do have storage, which, as Furong points out, are going to be more affluent households, to keep it and use it themselves, even if they're using it to do something that isn't necessarily delivering the best global outcome, like heating their swimming pool. And I think the supply model, you want to be able to design that to allow people to easily share their kind of local energy resources with neighbors or a local community, rather than keep it for themselves. But at the moment, if you sell the energy that you've generated from your PV, you get like a fifth of what you would have bought energy for. So you are incentivized even to heat your swimming pool or run a washing machine to wash two things or something. And that's, I think, not good.
Thanks, David. We've got another comment online from Scott about interconnectors, which is something we have looked at in the SuperGen Energy Networks Hub. Susan Scholes has looked at thinking about HVDC interconnectors as being analogous to storage. But yeah, Scott, please, would you like to come in and make your point?
Yeah, it was just, building on what Robert has said and just acknowledging the fact that, as well as storage, there are other potential solutions to help improve reliability, resilience that, if we just kind of focus on, the storage and the need for a grid conversation, well, I think we have to look at more broadly, because, if we are to accept the interconnectors are role to play here, then clearly we need a grid as well for that to be feasible.
Thanks, Scott. So in a way there, you're saying, don't just think about more storage. Greater interconnectivity can have similar or the same effect. Is that essentially the point?
Yeah, I think so. I think, when we're looking at, the same way that we look at decarbonisation, we look across a range of different solutions rather than just, putting all of our eggs in the one low carbon basket. In the same way that when we're looking at kind of network resilience or supply reliability, if we're considering interconnectors as having a role to play as well as storage, then we have to obviously accept the fact that we need a grid to transport that power.
Thanks very much, Scott. Anybody got any further comments on that one? I'll come to the audience here in the room soon for comments as well.
I've got a couple of comments on that. One is, I would argue that interconnectors are network. They're just taken kind of to the next level. And interconnectors suffer from exactly the same diminishing return as networks do and as storage does. You can build infinite interconnection between two countries, and the 100th gigawatt you put in will have no value whatsoever because they've already shared everything they can share. So interconnectors are part of this kind of decision problem of how much of each thing do we want to put in, which is dependent on everything else.
Thanks, David.
I'd probably agree with you to an extent in that, a lot of these grids are already operating at capacity, and therefore, it perhaps limits the role that interconnection can play here because they're already kind of, full of electricity. So I think that is probably something that, again, maybe it requires more kind of smart grid operation in that respect. I don't know.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any comments here?
I think how this, I think that's purely looking into electricity. Is, I think it's one element. I think future would be the race between electrical and the high gas system, and then to what extent and to what time they might have equal or one might take higher priority than the other. I think it's very much dependent on the technology development and the cost of this and the consumer acceptance and how the policy directive might make it clear. And currently there got so much uncertainties. It is a big interesting questions to look into.
Absolutely. Thank you for. I'm sorry, I'm just looking to see if there are questions in the room. But Alessandra, feel free.
Just a quick comment. I think that given the very complex challenge that we have ahead of us, we need different solutions. So interconnectors might definitely help to solve imbalances. They can be coordinated with large scale or small scale storage devices, and we need to consider all the net present value. So it's the cost benefit analysis of all these solutions. And definitely it's not only about electrical or about batteries, but we can think of multi-energy storage systems. So again, for buildings, we have the thermal mass, the envelope of the building that can be used as a thermal storage systems and coordinated with electrical storage systems, taking advantage of this interaction and all the different time scales. There are a lot of potential intelligent solutions that we can work on.
Thanks, Alessandra. Sarah, please.
So I'd like to ask the panel sometimes what is globally optimal isn't the same as what is locally optimal, and particularly for heat networks, which are quite local, and people being used to having heat storage in their homes. What's the panel's thoughts on the benefits of a local optimal solution, even if that isn't the global optimal solution in meeting local needs?
A great question, Sarah. Tough one. You're making the panel work here. Any thoughts? What do we think about that?
Yes, this is a very interesting solution, and it's something that the techniques I work with, which are distributed control, is something that it's the challenge that we need to tackle, basically, how to achieve a global optimum, but also trying to satisfy what is local. They might be definitely conflicting, but the challenge is that we need to try to make sure that the local objectives and constraints are satisfied, but still there should be something that yes, globally benefit everyone. So there should be some global criteria and that's why we need the network, because there is this strong coupling and interconnection. These are connected devices. So I think we need to consider both. This is maybe a very easy answer, but I think that there are techniques that allow us to do that.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that I just would like to add that our solutions, some solutions are naturally local, some solutions naturally global. For example, district heating, you wouldn't really want to transport heating over a long distance. But if it's electrical wire, then you can transport energy, you can heat locally. So I would imagine you need to do a lot of segmentation, both in terms of supplies, what are the intermittent and different profile supply, and also demand, what could be local heat demand and other transport demand and power demand, and what are the best mix. I think you need to actually, it is a big jigsaw, how you can have a first stage of organization to understand the solution locality and globally, and supply likewise, and how you actually match the two. So I would be really excited to see that how we segment and then how we couple at different stage of this technology and supply and demand.
Yeah, so we're hearing a lot here about trying to find an optimal blend or mix of different things, but I do wonder whether we have the tools available. Are the tools available, do you think, and developed to allow us to get to these answers? And I guess another challenge I would say is, even if you did want to do the global optimization, is that a fantasy? Do we have enough information and computational capability to even work out what it is? And does it ever stay as a fixed answer for long enough that you ever build anything that's globally optimal?
I would imagine you can take two approaches. One is that we directly get into the future, and this is how the future looks like, and we can develop a tool, and assuming nothing exists currently. Another is really you start from what we are currently, because the whole system is not going to change overnight. So what are the incremental change we can do over 5 years? And potentially, I think once you're going forward, another forward into future, another future back to present, and potentially the two paths might meet or support each other to infer two solutions.
Yeah. Alessandra, please.
Yeah, and I think that we have very interesting methods that might help, but I don't think there is one single method that can address all these challenges. We need to come up with an intelligent combination, several methods that can address part of the challenges. And the other point I wanted to make is that maybe we don't really need a global optimum. Maybe we just need the best decision, or something that is reasonable, is a reasonable trade-off, because maybe the global optimum is not achievable.
Yeah. Interesting.
Can I just
Please, yeah, and then I'm going to go to Victor.
I want to brief on that. Yeah, I think heat networks are a particularly interesting example. But I think in general, the problem with trying to say we could achieve that global optimal solution, there'd be some people who would be less well done by it than others, right? And that's where Sarah's point about local versus global optimals comes from. So you'd want to be able to either incentivize those people whose local optimal might be good, but might cost everyone else to kind of go along with everyone else. But also you want to, I think it's really important to like take people on board. I think I'm very skeptical of massive top-down decrees and mega projects, and more in favor of stuff that is coming more from a kind of community level, because you're not going to get that kind of discontentment or feel of detachment. But equally, I'm also skeptical of people of kind of incentives we have now, which just lead people to build stuff and keep it themselves and use it themselves. So I think that neither is right, and you need something in between, and probably different to either now.
Thank you. Victor, and then Jinjung, please.
Thank you. As always now with the bottom-up approach, so that means local opting first, because definitely there will be big differences between regions, between different parts of the country, etc., etc. So once we get a set of local optima, then we can look into on the high level what we got, and then we can, if we are not happy, we can feedback via constraints or changes into local ones. Now, top-down approach, which means getting the global, and that really can be infeasible, impossible to solve. People who are doing these methodologies are economists involved in macroeconomics. And then optimization is always linear. So mixed integer linear optimization at most. And then, so you have a huge set of equations, blah, blah, inequality, blah, blah. However, the main question is how good linear models are for our real life systems. That can be changed.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you very much. I'm hoping people can still hear these comments from the room. Please, if someone could indicate whether they could hear that, so we know whether we need to bring people forward or whether I need to relay the comments. But I'll go to Jinjung now. Thank you, Robert. Thank you.
Jinjung from Cardiff University. Firstly, thank you very much for the members. Such an interesting discussion. So I have 3 questions, but I will only ask one. But the other 2 as a context. So my questions are when, where, and what. When is what the time for this question, specific question, what the time scale we're looking at. So if we look at 100 years later, so probably the answer may be very uncertain. We may go for the energy storage, to be honest. But let's say if we look at 2050, it's a key time level for the UK. So let's look at that. It's one context. Another one is where we're talking about this. So come back to Melissa's comments. If we look at some rural areas, so the answer will be very different in Amazon area or in Africa. So let's focus on the UK. So this is the second question I had, but now I will put as a context. So now come to my question. If we look at UK, 2050 is your target for this specific question. So I really would like a panel to share your thoughts on how do you think about the carbon emission, the implications of different solutions for the storage related solution and the grid related solution. What the implications on carbon emission? That's the life cycle emission. So we look at the manufacturing of this storage, local generation together. So it would be good if Ant would share this or something.
You're working the panel hard there. That's another great question. Thank you. Can I open that up then? There was a few dimensions to that.
I think that's it's like what we said before, that without energy, we wouldn't have we wouldn't be able to meet demand. So we need to have energy, and I think that there got a significant element of energy being offshore renewable energy and nuclear. So with that in mind, I think that you still need to have significant energy network to transfer to where it's needed most. Storage, I think, dependent how you add in storage. If it's additional add-on, then you need to add in additional components. When you have additional components, they always got carbon implications in addition to operation. So I would imagine if this energy storage have multiple purposes, if the supporting heating like hydrogen, and supporting transport, hydrogen also does that. And in addition to electricity, I think that might get carbon intensity much lower. Then you have as-on components as only purposes for energy storage. Then by adding additional energy storage, you have huge carbon implications for getting raw material, to manufacture them, to transport, to deploy, and then operation.
Thank you. Any other comments?
I think the emission question is closely related to what I discussed with the cost question, because if you get your balance of storage plus network wrong and end up building way too much of one, that has a big carbon cost. And then there's also, they both cost you carbon when you use them, like Florent said. So the network is going to have losses, whatever kind of network it is. The storage is going to have losses, whatever kind of storage it is. But I think if you build too much network, you probably end up with lower losses at least. So I would probably hedge more on the side of building more network, but I'm a networks person, so quite biased.
Yeah. Thank you.
No, I mean, it's a very tough question. And I was always thinking that, of course, storage devices can definitely help with increasing the penetration of renewable energy, and so have the possibility to have more clean electricity, to use more clean electricity. And as I said, the interaction among different energy vectors, also in terms of storage capabilities, can help. But in our the analysis, we always this is my personal view. It's always neglected the carbon impact of what happens when the storage life ends. So the impact of the dismission of these technologies, and also the manufacturing, as Frank said. So this is rarely included in the analysis, and it should be included.
I guess not just carbon either, other materials.
Yes,
that are,
in general, yeah, the environmental impact.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Peter, please.
Thanks, Peter Taylor from the University of Leeds. So I wonder whether the answer differs depending on the country context. So one of the biggest challenges I think we face globally is bringing modern energy services to the 700 million or more people that don't have electricity at the moment. And if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, then it seems that the solution tends to be favouring some micro or mini grids with storage rather than extending the national grid. So I wonder whether in that context, actually, the balance is shifting away from networks, at least on the grand scale, and more towards the storage solution with a much smaller network connected to it. And I just wonder if the panel had any comment on that.
What do we think of that?
Yeah, I think that for the countryside, we have been working with Botswana and also currently work with Kenya. I think we've got two observations for Botswana. I think that even for remote rural community, the grid companies still actually have a huge power. Even if they've got frequent power interruption, they still wouldn't permit a large remote microgrid to be built. So they've got a lot of regulation and policy issue that sub-Saharan country got addressed. Another striking thing we observed in Kenya is really in rural community, the energy demand is so low. It's sometimes it's 7 watts, very light lighting purposes, and you just feel that if the people got to transform their life, improve economy, you've got to actually develop transport, got to develop vaccination, cooling for the harvest. So I just feel for that part of the country, and we also observe that they have a more energy during daytime. They got plenty solar power, but not enough demand. And getting demand together and align with grid is actually currently they haven't got such a ready technology that they can deploy or possibly not encouraged. So UK packed funding actually provides significant support to see how the UK experts, UK community group can help remote communities in Kenya and Botswana to develop their energy supply and especially towards low carbon community. But I think the biggest challenge is policy regulation.
Thanks, Florent. Any other comments? Not essential.
Yeah, I think the country context is definitely very important, and that's it. You've contrasted some quite extreme examples. I think that specifically on the people that currently don't have any electricity, it depends what the outcome is. So I think in the next kind of 10, 15 years, then sure, off-grid solutions are going to be the quickest and kind of cheapest, most effective way to get them electrification. But in the longer term, like Florent said, at the moment, some of these households use 7 watts. So, but I don't think in the long term, if we're going to have a kind of fair and equitable transition to a clean kind of global economy, you want those people to still be using 7 watts in 2050, right? So at that point, you maybe have to either build some much bigger storage and off-grid sites or connect them to a network. I think that as development happens, it will transition from one to the other. But even comparing different countries, it's very different. So for example, if you compare GB and Norway doesn't need any storage because they've got loads. So they just need a network, whereas we might not, or you can, yeah. So it's definitely very country dependent in every case, not just in terms of development level, but also in terms of geography and probably also in terms of demographics and kind of social factors like willingness to accept different things.
Thanks, David. Okay, so can't see any other hands just for a moment. What I wondered if I could take a question to put to the panel here, but maybe drawing on Mudita's point. So Mudita earlier is talking about the fact that resilience of the network was a driver towards storage. And I'm just thinking about countries where everywhere around the world are going to experience climate change between now and 2050. And even now, look at what Storm Arwen did to the network here in this region, where we had huge numbers of people off supply and for long durations. And the main reason for that actually was high wind speeds and the fact that the network is predominantly overhead line and it's getting blown over. So in that case, the network was a weakness. It was a problem. It produced vulnerability for customers. Now, if we're going to see more and more climate change like that across the world, could you argue, and this is me arguing against networks again, but just because I think, I just want to stir it up because we've all been a bit pro network, which you might expect. But you could argue that, in Northumberland, network is absolutely not what you want, or certainly not overhead line anyway, if we're going to see climate change. Comments, please.
I guess networks can expose you to common mode events like that because everyone's connected together. I think that whatever you design or install, it has to be designed and installed with climate adaptation in mind. The network doesn't have to be vulnerable to wind necessarily, but the ways you might make it less vulnerable to wind are going to be more expensive. But equally, the network used to be vulnerable to flooding, and interventions meant that now very much less is. And you're not going to get the same extreme events in every part of the world. And so I think, yeah, there's a big case to work with people who have got expertise in what future climates might look like, and try and anticipate what those extreme events are and make the networks resilient that proactively rather than reactively, as we have done to now.
There's a similar point could be made about cyber resilience as well. If someone can hack into the network, they only have to get into the network and they can cause disruption to millions of people. Again, it's that common mode thing. Because of networks interconnect things, does that actually bring about vulnerability? Any thoughts?
Yeah, indeed, it's hard to identify, and as you mentioned, maybe there is some of the lines that are more vulnerable, and storage devices might help to improve the resilience of the overall grid if well placed, of course, but it's not that the overall network, so we don't need the overall network, but maybe there are just a few points that are more vulnerable. And the same for the, yes, when there is interconnection, there are these risks, but there are tools that can help us. So these, I do not think that this brings us to think that the overall network is not needed, actually.
I think network could potentially do have a lot of redundancies, but that redundancies in the past to cater for N-1, N-2 contingencies, largely for transmission and extra high voltage. But as we go forward, that if we build similar redundancies for the resilience, where you have common mode of failure, that resilience could be really extensive. So it really says how, if we want to design our network, what condition we would drive. Can we using the old philosopher, or we possibly move into the new philosopher? It's possibly impossible to secure every single event that might happen. It's very expensive for so much redundant network to waiting for once in 10-year events. So I think that's Phil talked this before, and I also heard people from the industry saying it's a mobile solution that can meeting emergency needs, and those mobile solution could be shared among network companies across the country. So you possibly need to have a different layers of provision for meeting emergency needs. Some comes from network, some comes from this mobile solution, and some comes from customers into the future.
So I think it's really interesting that Northern Power Grid have been told that their response to Arwen was not optimal, because they tried to rebuild network when what they probably could have done, as well as rebuild network, is put storage or backup generation, which I guess is storage in a way, out at homes to get people back on supply rather than being purely a network focus. So we've circled back round in and out of networks back to storage again. And Laiz, who's here today, has been doing research on exactly that question. Victor, you wanted to come in. We're almost out of time. Any online questions, please type them in now. Victor.
So resilience of networks, overhead lines, whatever. Somebody was talking about the flood resilience. It is all driven by the regulator. So basically, the regulator now drives for flood resilience from 1 in 50 years to 1 in 75 years. Similarly, they can redefine the criteria for exempt events. Exempt events are those events which do not count toward the quality of supply purposes. So it must be worked with object to increase investment in overhead networks, and then we are going to have better resilience. Of course, diesel generators, of course, storage and others.
Thanks, Victor. So that might come back to a conversation we were having earlier about what policy and regulation might the research need to influence There's potentially some work to do to get these regulations changed around resilience.
Yeah,
That could be an interesting thing
a
to
good
do.
example is generally, if you've got storage in a bit of network somewhere, it's not allowed to operate that bit of network as an island, which is what it needs to do for resilience. And if you do some maths and work out the kind of contribution to resilience of that storage, if it's allowed to island, then the contribution would be very high.
Yeah.
And if it's not allowed to island, the contribution is almost nothing. So that's definitely a change. And I think, I just finished working on a project where we were looking at installing storage in local communities for like a lot of different objectives, and one of them was resilience, but others are reducing costs and increasing the amount of renewable energy you can use, and selling kind of flexibilities that elsewhere in the system. And if communities can be incentivized to do that, and then work with the network company to be allowed to operate the storage for resilience as well, I think that gives you that kind of benefits everywhere that you wouldn't necessarily get just by Northern Power Grid being more focused on deploying storage or generators than fixing network.
Yeah, I think another thing that network research tend to focus is how to pass in network needs into network services and passing this information to customer. Possibly less emphasis on how customers can pass in their information to network operator. For example, value loss load in extreme events, how different customers might tolerate different level of supply interruption, and how you're packaging that from individual customers into a population into different levels of system. So there's a two-way interaction between network owner or operator and network customers. I think really critical going forward if we want to have a resilient, affordable, and secure system.
Thanks, Furong. Okay, well, look, I think we'll probably stop there because we're just about out of time. But thanks very much to everyone online and in the room here for taking part. I think that was a really interesting debate. Let's maybe give a round of applause to our panel. Thank you. Okay, so I'll bid farewell to the online group. Any feedback about this, please let us know. Thank you very much.